I was 67 years old when I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones capable of hurting you the deepest. It was Thanksgiving Day, 2019, and I was sitting at what I thought was my family's dinner table when my daughter-in-law, Jessica, leaned over to her sister and whispered just loud enough for everyone to hear, "He doesn't belong here anymore." She was talking about me, her own father-in-law, the man who had walked her down the aisle when her own father refused to show up. I picked up my wine glass, took a long sip of the Cabernet I'd brought, a bottle that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a week, and I made a decision that would change everything. But before I tell you what I did in that moment, before I share how I got my revenge on the woman who tried to erase me from my own son's life, I need you to understand the whole story. Because what happened next wasn't just about one cruel comment at dinner. It was about 5 years of systematic manipulation, financial betrayal, and a conspiracy that went deeper than I ever imagined. And if you're someone who's ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been pushed aside by people who were supposed to care about you, then what you're about to hear might save you from making the same mistakes I made. So hit that subscribe button right now, because by the end of this story you're going to understand why sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to go to war. My name is Eugene Kowalski, and I used to think I knew what family meant. I'd built my life around that word. 38 years as a union electrician in Chicago, working my way up from apprentice to foreman to eventually running my own crew. My hands were rough from decades of wire and conduit. My back ached from crawling through crawl spaces. But every morning I got up and did the work because I had a family to provide for. My wife Margaret, God rest her soul, and our son Danny. Margaret died in 2012, cervical cancer that the doctors caught too late. 7 months from diagnosis to funeral, and Danny barely made it home from college for the end. He was finishing his MBA at Northwestern, had big dreams about finance and Wall Street. I was proud of him, even if I didn't understand half the things he talked about when he came home for holidays. All those numbers and market strategies. It might as well have been a foreign language to a guy who'd spent his career making sure the lights stayed on. After the funeral, it was just Danny and me. He'd graduated by then, landed a job at a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Chicago. Good money, better than I'd ever made, and he moved into a nice apartment in Lincoln Park. For a while, we had dinner every couple of weeks. He'd drive out to the old neighborhood. We'd order pizza from Lou Malnati's, watch the Bears lose another game they should have won. Then he met Jessica. I'll give credit where it's due. She was beautiful. Blonde hair that always looked like she'd just stepped out of a salon. Perfect teeth. The kind of smile that could sell ice to Eskimos. She worked in marketing for some downtown agency, wore designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. When Danny first brought her around in 2015, I could see he was smitten. The way he looked at her, it reminded me of how I used to look at Margaret when we were young. Jessica was polite enough at first. Shook my hand, complimented the house, asked appropriate questions about my work. But there was something in her eyes, something calculating that I couldn't quite put my finger on. She had this way of looking around the old two-flat like she was taking inventory, like she was already planning how to redecorate. The house had been Margaret's pride and joy. We'd bought it in 1983 when Danny was just 3 years old. It wasn't fancy, working-class Polish neighborhood on the northwest side, small front yard, vinyl siding that I repainted every few years. But it was ours. Margaret had spent weekends at estate sales and thrift stores, slowly filling it with the kind of warm, lived-in furniture that made it feel like home. Family photos on every surface, Danny's school pictures and report cards still magneted to the refrigerator even though he was 26 years old. Jessica's place was different. Everything white and chrome and sharp angles like a hotel lobby. When Danny started spending more time there, I understood. Young couple in love, they wanted their privacy. But I missed those Sunday dinners. Missed having someone to talk to about the little things. What happened at work. Something funny I heard on the radio. The way the neighborhood was changing. They got engaged in spring of 2016. Danny called me from the restaurant where he'd proposed, could barely contain his excitement as he described how he'd hidden the ring in her dessert. I was happy for him, truly, but when he asked me to meet them the next day to celebrate, Jessica had already made reservations at some place downtown where the appetizers cost $30 and the waiters looked at my worn work boots like I'd tracked mud through a museum. That's when I started to notice the little things. How Jessica would subtly redirect conversations when Danny started talking about his childhood, about Margaret, about the old neighborhood. How she'd wrinkle her nose when we passed Polish restaurants or delis, make comments about wanting Danny to try new things, broaden his horizons. How she'd mention other young couples they knew, people with parents who had vacation homes in Michigan or condos in Florida. But Danny was happy, and that's all that mattered to me. If she made him happy, I could live with the rest. The wedding was in October 2016, at some country club in the suburbs that probably charged more for flowers than I made in a month. Jessica's family had money. Her father owned a chain of dental practices. Her mother sat on charity boards and played tennis at the club twice a week. They were nice enough people, but they had that polished, professional courtesy that never quite reached their eyes when they looked at me. Jessica's father had been distant throughout the engagement, and 2 weeks before the wedding, he announced he wouldn't be walking her down the aisle. Some falling out over her choice to marry Danny instead of the banker they'd introduced her to the year before. Jessica was devastated, and Danny was furious. That's when I stepped in. I'd offered to walk her down the aisle myself. She'd cried when I suggested it, thrown her arms around me and called me the father she'd always wanted. It was one of the proudest moments of my life, wearing the new suit Danny had insisted on buying for me, walking that beautiful girl toward my son while 200 guests watched. Even Margaret's sisters were crying. For a few months after the wedding, things were good. Jessica seemed genuinely grateful, would hug me extra tight when they came for dinner, tell people about how I'd saved her wedding day. Danny looked happier than I'd seen him since before his mother got sick. They were talking about buying a house, maybe starting a family in a few years. That's when everything started to change. It began with small things. Jessica would make comments about how the old house was too big for just me, how I was getting older and might want to think about downsizing. She'd bring up articles she'd read about seniors who'd fallen and couldn't get help, about break-ins in changing neighborhoods, always framed as concern, always with Danny nodding along because he wanted to be a good husband. Then she started talking about investments, how Danny was doing so well at the firm, how they were looking at properties in better neighborhoods, how it was such a waste that I was sitting on all that equity when I could be helping my son build his future. After all, wouldn't I want Danny to have the same advantages she'd grown up with? I'll admit, part of me was tempted. The house was worth about $400,000 by then, way more than Margaret and I had ever imagined when we bought it. And I did want Danny to have every opportunity. So when Jessica suggested I could sell the house and move into a nice senior community while lending them the money for a down payment on their dream home, it almost sounded reasonable. Almost. But something in my gut told me to wait. Maybe it was 38 years of dealing with contractors who promised the moon and delivered half a job. Maybe it was the way Jessica's eyes lit up when she talked about the money but went flat when she talked about the senior community. Or maybe it was just that the house still smelled like Margaret's perfume, and I wasn't ready to let that go. So I told them I'd think about it. Jessica's smile got a little tighter, but she nodded and said, "Of course, it was a big decision. Take all the time I needed." That's when the real campaign began. Suddenly, every conversation included references to how isolated I was, how the neighborhood was going downhill, how worried they were about me living alone. Jessica would call during the day when Danny was at work, just to check in, she said. But the conversations always ended up in the same place. Wouldn't I be happier somewhere with people my own age? Wouldn't it be nice to have activities and community, and not have to worry about maintaining a big old house? Danny started echoing the same concerns. Maybe not in the same words, but the message was clear. They thought I was becoming a burden. They thought I couldn't take care of myself anymore. And slowly, insidiously, I started to believe them. The truth was, I was lonely. The old neighborhood was changing. Young families moving in, young professionals who worked downtown and barely nodded when they passed you on the street. My buddies from the union were scattered, some retired to Florida, others dealing with their own health problems. The local bar where we used to gather after work had closed, replaced by some trendy coffee shop that charged $5 for drinks with names I couldn't pronounce. I started spending more time at home, watching television shows I didn't care about, eating frozen dinners in front of the evening news. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that nobody else seemed to want to hear. When I tried to tell Danny stories about his mother, about the early days of our marriage, about the dreams we'd had for our family, his attention would drift. He'd check his phone, mention some work emergency, cut the conversation short with promises to call later that never materialized. Jessica was more subtle in her dismissal, but somehow that made it worse. She'd listen politely to my stories, make appropriate comments, ask follow-up questions that seemed thoughtful. But I could see something calculating in her eyes, like she was filing away information about my mental state, my living situation, my emotional vulnerabilities. Later, I realized she was building a case, evidence that I was becoming dependent, confused, unable to manage my own affairs. The campaign to move me out of the house intensified after I had what Jessica dramatically called the incident. I'd been working on a small electrical repair in the basement, replacing an old outlet that had been sparking intermittently. It was simple work, the kind of thing I'd done thousands of times, but I'd forgotten to flip the circuit breaker before starting. When I touched the live wire, I got a shock that knocked me backward into my workbench. I wasn't hurt, embarrassed more than anything, but Jessica treated it like I'd nearly died. She called Danny at work, insisted he come home immediately, made a huge production about how I could have been electrocuted, how I was too old to be doing electrical work, how it was a miracle I hadn't started a fire that would have burned down the whole block. Danny, to his credit, was more concerned than dramatic. He checked to make sure I wasn't injured, helped me finish the repair properly, suggested that maybe I should call professionals for electrical work in the future. But Jessica wouldn't let it go. "This is exactly what I've been worried about," she said, as if I wasn't standing right there. "He's forgetting basic safety procedures, taking risks he would never have taken 10 years ago. What happens when he has a more serious accident? What happens if he falls and can't get to the phone?" She started researching articles about seniors and home safety, printing them out and leaving them on my kitchen counter when she came to visit. Stories about elderly people who'd fallen downstairs, who'd left stoves burning, who'd been found days later by worried neighbors, always with the same message: living alone was dangerous for people my age, and the responsible thing was to move somewhere with professional supervision. The psychological pressure was relentless. Every minor mistake became evidence of decline. When I forgot Danny's birthday one year, something that had never happened before, but I'd been dealing with a particularly bad bout of flu, Jessica treated it like a symptom of dementia. When I got confused about the date of a doctor's appointment and showed up a day early, she suggested I might need help managing my calendar. Most insidiously, she started questioning my decision-making in front of other people. At family gatherings with her parents, she'd mention my episodes with a tone of loving concern that made me sound like a confused child. She'd tell stories about finding me wandering around the house looking for my reading glasses, which I'd been doing for 20 years, long before I'd ever met her, as if it were evidence of cognitive decline. The worst part was that some of her concerns were legitimate. I was getting older. I was making the occasional mistake. I did sometimes feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of maintaining a big house by myself. But Jessica took these normal signs of aging and weaponized them, using my vulnerabilities against me to serve her own agenda. And gradually, insidiously, I started to believe her narrative about my declining competence. Maybe I was becoming a burden. Maybe I was too stubborn to see what was obvious to everyone else. Maybe the people who loved me were right to be worried about my ability to live independently. It's a terrible thing when the people closest to you start treating you like you're incompetent. You begin to second-guess every decision, to question every instinct, to wonder if your own perceptions can be trusted. I'd spent 40 years as a skilled tradesman, solving complex problems and managing dangerous situations, but Jessica's constant undermining made me feel like I couldn't be trusted to make a cup of coffee. So when Jessica found what she called the perfect senior community, independent living apartments with meal plans and activities and transportation to shopping, I agreed to take a tour. Sunset Manor was nice enough, I'll give it that. Clean, modern apartments with kitchen facilities and enough space for my basic furniture. A common room where residents played cards and watched television. A dining room that served 3 meals a day. The marketing director, a cheerful woman named Linda, walked me through the amenities like she was selling me a cruise ship. The monthly fee was $2,800. Not cheap but doable if I sold the house and invested the proceeds wisely. And Jessica had already found the perfect financial advisor, a colleague of Danny's who could help me maximize my returns. That should have been my first red flag. But I was 64 years old, tired, and increasingly convinced that maybe they were right. Maybe it was time to simplify my life. The paperwork was remarkably efficient. Jessica had already researched real estate agents, gotten preliminary estimates on the house value, even identified a few potential buyers. All I had to do was sign on the dotted line and let the professionals handle everything. The house sold in 6 weeks for $412,000. After agent fees and closing costs, I walked away with $385,000. More money than I'd ever seen at one time in my life. Danny and Jessica were at the closing, beaming like proud parents as I endorsed the check over to their financial advisor for investment. They'd already picked out their new house, a beautiful colonial in Hinsdale with 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a 2-car garage. The down payment was exactly $200,000. What a coincidence. I moved into Sunset Manor on a gray November day in 2017. Danny and Jessica helped me pack, and I'll admit there was something touching about watching my son carefully wrap Margaret's china, making sure each piece was protected. Jessica organized everything with military precision, labeling boxes and creating inventory lists. She was good at that kind of thing. But as I watched them load my entire life into the back of a rented truck, I felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't just sadness. It was a creeping sense that I'd made a terrible mistake. The feeling got stronger when Jessica made a comment about finally being able to update some of my old furniture. Maybe donate the pieces that wouldn't fit in the new apartment. Donate Margaret's rocking chair. The dining table where we'd eaten thousands of meals as a family. The bookshelf I'd built with my own hands. But it was too late. The house was sold, the papers were signed, and I was officially a resident of Sunset Manor. For the first few months, I tried to make the best of it. The other residents were friendly enough, mostly retired teachers and office workers who'd lived similar middle-class lives. We played cribbage in the evenings, watched old movies in the common room, shared stories about our families over dinner. But something was wrong with my finances. The monthly statements from the investment account showed steady losses. When I called Danny to ask about it, he assured me it was just market volatility, temporary fluctuations that would even out over time. The advisor was making strategic adjustments to protect my principal. I should trust the process. Jessica was even more reassuring. She'd researched the investment firm thoroughly, she said. They specialized in accounts for retirees, conservative strategies designed to preserve wealth while generating steady income. A few bad months didn't mean anything in the long-term picture, but the bad months kept coming. By summer of 2018, my original $385,000 had shrunk to just over $200,000. I was spending $2,800 a month on the apartment, plus another $1,000 on miscellaneous expenses, and my Social Security barely covered groceries and personal items. At this rate, I'd be broke in less than 6 years. When I tried to discuss this with Danny, he seemed distracted. He and Jessica were busy with their new house, their new life. They'd made friends in Hinsdale, joined the country club, started talking about having kids. My concerns about money seemed petty in comparison to their exciting future. That's when I decided to do some research on my own. The Hinsdale Public Library had computers with internet access, and one of the librarians, a patient woman named Carol, helped me figure out how to look up information about investment firms and financial advisors. What I found made my blood run cold. The firm managing my money had been cited by the SEC multiple times for questionable practices. The advisor Danny had recommended had been sanctioned twice for putting clients into high-risk investments without proper disclosure. And the strategy they were using with my account, aggressive growth funds with high fees and frequent trading, was exactly the opposite of what they'd told me they were doing. I printed out everything I could find and drove to Danny's office that same afternoon. He worked on the 14th floor of a glass tower downtown, in a world of suits and ties and people who looked like they'd never gotten their hands dirty. When I walked into the reception area with my manila folder full of printouts, I felt like a relic from another century. Danny agreed to see me, but he only had a few minutes. Some important client was coming in for a meeting. I spread the documents across his desk and explained what I'd found. His face went pale as he read, but when he looked up, his expression was defensive. He hadn't known about the firm's history, he said. His colleague had recommended them based on their performance numbers, not their regulatory record. These things happened in the financial industry. It didn't necessarily mean they were doing anything wrong with my account. We could look into transferring the funds if I was really concerned. But when I asked to see the detailed statements to understand exactly what investments they'd made with my money, Danny got uncomfortable. That information was confidential, he said, protected by privacy regulations. I'd have to request it directly from the firm. Something in his tone set off alarm bells. This was my son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework and walked to school every morning for 6 years. Why was he talking to me like I was some stranger trying to pry into his business? I left his office with more questions than answers, and a growing suspicion that there was more to this story than bad investment advice. It took me 3 weeks to get the detailed statements from the investment firm. When they finally arrived, I needed Carol the librarian to help me understand what I was looking at. The technical language was deliberately confusing, but the pattern was clear enough. My money hadn't been invested in conservative growth funds like they'd promised. Instead, it had been used for high-risk options trading, currency speculation, and something called leveraged ETFs that I didn't understand, but that seemed to lose money faster than I could calculate. And the fees, God, the fees were enormous. Management fees, trading fees, advisory fees, performance fees. They were taking thousands of dollars every quarter regardless of whether my account made or lost money. But the real shock came when I looked at the trading dates. The majority of the high-risk investments had been made within 2 months of Danny and Jessica buying their house, right around the time they would have needed cash for closing costs, furniture, landscaping, all the expenses that came with a new home in an expensive suburb. That's when I understood what had really happened. My son and daughter-in-law hadn't just convinced me to sell my house so they could use my money for their down payment. They'd also arranged for the rest of my life savings to be systematically transferred to them through a combination of high-risk investments and excessive fees. But the pattern went deeper than I'd initially realized. As I dug through months of statements and records, I discovered that the theft had been even more elaborate than I'd imagined. The investment firm hadn't just been making bad trades with my money, they'd been using it as collateral for margin loans that funded other investments. Investments that, according to the addresses on the account statements, were being made through shell companies registered to Danny's business address. My money wasn't just disappearing into bad trades. It was being deliberately siphoned off to fund Danny and Jessica's lifestyle. I found records of management fees that coincided exactly with their country club membership payments, advisory charges that matched the cost of Jessica's BMW lease, portfolio rebalancing costs that occurred the same week they took a European vacation they'd posted about extensively on social media. They'd been living off my life savings for over a year, and they'd structured it so cleverly that it looked like legitimate investment losses rather than outright theft. The most damning evidence came from Danny's own computer. During one of our Sunday dinners, before I'd figured out what was happening, I'd helped him troubleshoot a printer problem in his home office. While he was on a work call in the kitchen, I'd noticed he'd left his email open on the screen. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I couldn't help but see the subject line of a message from the investment advisor. Q3 distribution schedule, per our agreement. At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it, But now, armed with the knowledge of how my money was being handled, that phrase took on a different meaning entirely. There was an agreement between my son and the man who was supposed to be protecting my financial interests. An agreement about distributions from my account. I was being robbed by my own family, and they'd been planning it from the moment they met me. The confrontation happened on a Sunday in October 2018. I drove to their beautiful house in Hinsdale, the house I'd paid for, and rang the doorbell like a stranger. Jessica answered, dressed in yoga pants and a Northwestern sweatshirt, looking annoyed at being interrupted. Danny was in his home office, a room that used to be the formal dining room, surrounded by financial newspapers and computer monitors. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see the guilt in his eyes before I said a word. I placed the investment statements on his desk and asked him to explain. Not as his client, not as some confused old man who didn't understand modern finance. As his father, who deserved to know why his life savings were disappearing into high-risk trades that benefited no one except the people charging fees. Danny tried to bluster at first. These were sophisticated investment strategies, he said. Sometimes you had to take risks to generate real returns. The market was volatile, but over time these positions would pay off. I needed to trust the process, trust his expertise. But when I asked him directly whether he was receiving any compensation from the investment firm, whether there were any kickbacks or referral fees or undisclosed arrangements, his face went red, and he couldn't meet my eyes. That's when Jessica walked into the room. She'd been listening from the hallway, I realized later, waiting to see how Danny would handle the situation, whether he'd crack under pressure. When it became clear that he was about to confess, she stepped in with the performance of her life. "How dare I accuse them of stealing?" she said. "After everything they'd done for me, they'd researched the best investment options, connected me with qualified professionals, helped me transition to a lifestyle that was appropriate for my age. If I was unhappy with the results, that was my choice to make, but I had no right to blame them for market conditions they couldn't control." And then came the line that should have prepared me for what would happen a year later at Thanksgiving. "You're not thinking clearly anymore," she said. "Maybe it's time to consider whether you're really capable of managing your own affairs." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. If I continued to make trouble, if I insisted on investigating their financial arrangements, they would have me declared incompetent, a confused old man whose mental faculties were declining, who needed professional help managing his money and his healthcare decisions. Danny didn't contradict her. He sat there behind his expensive desk in his expensive house and let his wife threaten his own father with guardianship proceedings. I left without saying another word. What was there to say? I'd raised a son who would steal from his own family, and I'd loved a daughter-in-law who would destroy me to protect her secrets. The drive back to Sunset Manor was the longest 20 miles of my life. For months after that confrontation, I barely heard from them. Occasionally, Danny would call, awkward conversations where he'd ask about my health and mention how busy they were with work and the house. No mention of the money, no follow-up on my concerns about the investments, as if that conversation had never happened. Jessica's calls stopped entirely. The woman who used to check on me every few days, who'd once told me I was the father she'd always wanted, suddenly had no time for a lonely old man whose usefulness had expired. My account balance continued to shrink. By spring of 2019, I was down to less than $150,000. At my current burn rate, I'd be completely broke within 3 years. And then what? Medicaid? Some county-run nursing home where they warehoused old people until they died? That's when I started to fight back. The first thing I did was fire the investment advisor. It took 3 phone calls and a certified letter, but I finally got my remaining funds transferred to a simple savings account at a local credit union. No more fees, no more high-risk trading, no more mysterious monthly losses. The second thing I did was start researching elder financial abuse. Turned out it was more common than I'd thought, and there were resources available for people in my situation. The Area Agency on Aging had counselors who specialized in cases where family members had exploited seniors. The State Attorney General's office had an elder fraud unit that investigated financial crimes against older adults. But the more I learned about my legal options, the more depressed I became. Financial abuse cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the victims had voluntarily signed documents and worked with licensed professionals. Even if I could prove that Danny and Jessica had orchestrated the scheme, even if I could demonstrate that the investment advisor had acted improperly, the chances of recovering my money were slim. And there was another problem. I still loved my son. Despite everything he'd done, despite the betrayal and the theft and the casual cruelty, he was still the little boy I'd taught to catch fly balls in the backyard. He was still Margaret's son, and she would have wanted me to find a way to forgive him. But forgiveness didn't mean I had to be a victim. I spent the summer of 2019 planning my next move. Not revenge exactly, I'm not a vindictive man by nature. But I needed Danny and Jessica to understand that actions have consequences, that they couldn't just steal from me and expect to get away with it forever. The opportunity came in September, when Danny called to invite me to Thanksgiving at their house. Jessica had decided they should start hosting family holidays, he said. Her parents would be there, along with her sister and brother-in-law. It would be a chance for everyone to get together, to start some new traditions. I almost said no. The last thing I wanted was to spend a day being polite to the people who'd robbed me blind. But then I realized this might be exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. A chance to tell my story in front of witnesses, to let Jessica's family see what kind of person she really was. So I said yes. I'd be delighted to join them for Thanksgiving. The weeks leading up to the holiday gave me time to prepare. I gathered documents, bank statements, investment records, emails, phone records. Everything I needed to tell a complete story of how my life savings had been systematically stolen by my own family. I organized it all in a leather portfolio that had belonged to Margaret, the one she'd used for the household bills and insurance papers. I also made some other preparations. Contacted a lawyer who specialized in elder law, outlined my situation, and asked what my options might be if I decided to take legal action. The news wasn't encouraging. As I'd suspected, financial abuse cases involving willing participants were hard to prosecute. But he did give me some advice that would prove invaluable. Document everything, he said. Dates, times, conversations, witnesses. If you ever decide to pursue this, you'll need a detailed record of exactly what happened and when. So I started keeping a journal. Every interaction with Danny and Jessica, every phone call, every casual comment about my finances or my living situation. It was therapeutic in a way, putting the whole story down on paper. It helped me see the pattern of manipulation more clearly, the way they'd slowly convinced me to give up everything I'd worked for. Thanksgiving morning, I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to walk Jessica down the aisle, and drove to Hinsdale. Their house looked even more impressive than I remembered, with professional landscaping and seasonal decorations that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Jessica answered the door in a designer dress, all smiles and air kisses, acting like nothing had ever happened between us. The other guests were already there. Jessica's parents, Richard and Patricia, were exactly what you'd expect from successful professionals. Polished, well-dressed, the kind of people who'd never worried about money a day in their lives. Jessica's sister Amanda and her husband Kevin were younger versions of the same thing, a lawyer and a doctor who lived in an even more expensive suburb and drove matching BMW SUVs. Danny looked good, I'll give him that. Success agreed with him. His suit fit perfectly, his watch was expensive, his confidence was the kind that came from never having to worry about paying bills. When he introduced me to his in-laws, he was pleasant and respectful, called me Dad, mentioned how proud he was of my career as an electrician. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He knew I had questions that hadn't been answered. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jessica had gone all out for the meal. The dining room table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, cloth napkins, and fresh flowers. The food was catered, she mentioned casually, from some trendy restaurant downtown. Nothing but the best for her family's first Thanksgiving in the new house. The conversation over dinner was exactly what you'd expect. Work stories, vacation plans, discussion of the real estate market and the stock market and all the other topics that successful people talked about when they got together. I contributed when I could, shared a few stories about my union days, mentioned how much the neighborhood had changed since Danny was a boy. But I was waiting for my moment, and it came about halfway through the meal, when Patricia started talking about how wonderful it was that Danny and Jessica had been able to buy such a beautiful house at their age. In her day, she said, young couples had to start small, work their way up over decades. But Danny and Jessica had been so smart about their finances, so strategic about their investments. It was inspiring to see young people who understood the value of planning for the future. Jessica beamed at the compliment, reached over to squeeze Danny's hand. They'd been fortunate, she said, to have family support during the transition. My willingness to simplify my living situation had made it possible for them to move to Hinsdale sooner than they'd expected. That's when Amanda, Jessica's sister, made the comment that changed everything. It's so nice when parents can help their children get established, she said, looking directly at me. Kevin and I weren't as lucky. Both our fathers are still hanging on to their properties, too stubborn to downsize. You're lucky to have such a generous father-in-law, Jessica. Jessica's smile got a little tighter. She glanced at Danny, then back at her sister. We've been very blessed, she said carefully. Eugene made his own decision about the house. We just helped him explore his options. But Amanda wasn't done. She was slightly drunk, I realized, and in that state where people say things they normally keep to themselves. How much did you get for it? She asked me directly. The real estate market's been crazy in Chicago. You must have made out pretty well. $412,000, I said quietly. After expenses, about $385. A whistle from Kevin. That's serious money for a guy on a union pension. Good for you, Eugene. I bet you're set for life now. Jessica's face had gone pale. She was staring at her plate, probably calculating how much her sister had just revealed about their financial arrangements. Because Amanda clearly didn't know that my windfall had been immediately invested with Danny's colleague, or that it had mostly disappeared into high-risk trades and excessive fees. Actually, I said, setting down my wine glass, there's been a problem with the investments. I've lost about 2/3 of the money in less than 2 years. The table went quiet. Richard looked up from his turkey. Patricia stopped mid-chew. Kevin and Amanda both turned to stare at me. But it was Danny's reaction that told me everything I needed to know. He'd gone completely still, like a deer caught in headlights, waiting to see which way the hunter would shoot. I'm sorry to hear that, Richard said carefully. The market's been volatile lately. Did you work with a qualified advisor? Oh yes, I said. Danny recommended him personally, colleague of his from the investment firm. They specialized in accounts for retirees, very conservative strategies. At least that's what they told me. I pulled out the leather portfolio and set it on the table next to my plate. The timing was perfect. Everyone was looking, everyone was listening, and no one could leave without seeming rude. But when I started to open the portfolio, Jessica finally found her voice. I don't think this is appropriate dinner conversation, she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. We're here to celebrate Thanksgiving, not discuss financial matters that should remain private. She was right, of course, it wasn't appropriate. But neither was stealing $250,000 from your father-in-law, and that hadn't stopped her. I think your family should know what happened to the money, I said quietly, since they're so impressed with your financial success. That's when she said it. The line that would haunt me for months. The words that finally made me understand exactly how she saw me. She leaned toward her sister, but she spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. Just loud enough to sound like a whisper, but not quiet enough to keep it private. He doesn't belong here anymore, she said. He's confused. He doesn't understand how investments work, and he's trying to blame us for his own bad decisions. The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia looked mortified. Richard was studying his hands. Amanda and Kevin were staring at their plates like they contained the secrets of the universe. Even Danny looked shocked at his wife's bluntness. But I wasn't shocked. I was angry. Angrier than I'd been since Margaret's funeral, when the doctor had explained all the ways they could have caught her cancer earlier if they'd been more aggressive with testing. I picked up my wine glass, took a long sip of the Cabernet I'd brought, and looked directly at Jessica. "You're right," I said. "I don't belong here, because this house was bought with stolen money, and I don't associate with thieves." Then I opened the portfolio and began to read. The first document was my original investment agreement, the one that promised conservative growth strategies and minimal risk. I read the relevant sections aloud, slowly and clearly, so everyone could understand exactly what I'd been promised. The second document was the detailed trading record I'd finally obtained from the investment firm. I explained what each category meant, how much money had been lost in each type of high-risk investment, how much I'd paid in fees and commissions. The third document was the timeline I'd constructed, showing how the riskiest trades had coincided with Danny and Jessica's home purchase, their furniture purchases, their country club membership. And the fourth document was a printout of the SEC sanctions against the investment advisor, including a detailed description of his previous violations for putting clients into inappropriate high-risk investments. By the time I finished reading, Jessica was in tears and Danny looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Richard was taking notes on his phone, lawyer's instinct probably. Patricia was staring at her daughter like she'd never seen her before. Amanda broke the silence. "You stole from your own father-in-law?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jesus, Jessica, what were you thinking?" But Jessica wasn't done fighting. She wiped her eyes and looked around the table, trying to rally support for her version of events. "He wanted to invest the money," she said. "He asked Danny for advice about financial planning. We connected him with a qualified professional, someone with proper credentials and experience. If the investments didn't perform as expected, that's not our fault." "Then why didn't you tell him about the SEC sanctions?" I asked. "Why didn't you disclose that your colleague was getting kickbacks for referrals? Why didn't you explain that he'd be paying fees regardless of performance?" She didn't have an answer for that. Neither did Danny. But I wasn't done. I pulled out one more document, one I'd been saving for last. It was a printout of public records showing the financing for their house purchase. The down payment amount, the closing date, the mortgage details. "Interesting coincidence," I said. "You needed exactly $200,000 for your down payment, and that's exactly how much you convinced me to invest with your colleague. The same week I sold my house, you put in an offer on this one. The same day my money was transferred to the investment account, you signed the closing papers." Kevin was shaking his head in disgust. "You planned this from the beginning," he said. "You targeted your own father-in-law." That's when Danny finally spoke up. "It wasn't like that," he said, but his voice was weak and unconvincing. "We thought the investments would work out. We thought everyone would benefit." Richard had heard enough. He stood up from the table, motioned for Patricia to follow. "I think we should go," he said quietly. "This is a family matter that needs to be resolved privately." But before he left, he turned to his daughter. "I'm very disappointed in you, Jessica. This isn't how we raised you to treat family." After her parents left, the dynamic at the table shifted completely. Amanda and Kevin were clearly uncomfortable, but they seemed reluctant to abandon their hosts. Jessica had stopped crying and was now glaring at me with pure hatred. Danny looked like he was going to be sick. I closed the portfolio and stood up from the table. "Thank you for dinner," I said. It was very illuminating. When Jessica's voice stopped me at the door, "If you try to make trouble for us," she said, "we'll have you declared incompetent. We'll tell them you're having memory problems, that you can't take care of yourself anymore. No one will believe the word of a confused old man over two successful professionals." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. But instead of intimidating me, it clarified something that had been nagging at me for months. This wasn't just about money. It was about power. Jessica needed me to be helpless, confused, dependent. My competence threatened her narrative. My independence challenged her control. And suddenly I understood why she'd been so determined to get me out of my house, away from my neighborhood, isolated from the people who knew me as a capable, intelligent man. At Sunset Manor, surrounded by other retirees who were indeed struggling with age-related decline, my own capabilities would be less obvious. I'd be just another confused old man who needed professional help managing his affairs. But here, in Danny's expensive house, confronted with the evidence of their systematic theft, I felt more clear-headed than I had in years. I turned around and smiled at her. It was the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. "Actually," I said, "I've been recording our conversations for the past 6 months, including this one. Amazing what they can do with technology these days." It was a lie, of course. I didn't have any recordings. But the look of panic on Jessica's face, the way Danny's shoulders slumped in defeat, told me everything I needed to know about their confidence in their own innocence. I drove back to Sunset Manor that evening with a strange sense of peace. I'd done what I came to do. I'd told my story, exposed their lies, and planted the seeds of doubt in the minds of people who mattered to Jessica. Her own family now knew what kind of person she really was. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The real work began the next morning, and it started with a phone call I'd been dreading for months. I called my old foreman from the electrical union, Tommy Kowalski. No relation despite the name. Tommy had retired 3 years earlier, but he still knew everyone in the trade, still kept tabs on the political and financial machinations that affected working people's pensions and benefits. I told him what had happened, leaving out the family dynamics and focusing on the financial facts. An elderly retiree, convinced to liquidate his primary asset and invest the proceeds with an advisor who had regulatory violations, who had then lost most of the money through inappropriate high-risk trading. Tommy's response was immediate and profane. "Those blood-sucking bastards," he said. "It's the same scam they've been running on retirees for years. Convince them to move their money into managed accounts and then charge fees whether they make money or not. We've been fighting this crap in the pension system for decades." But then Tommy said something that changed everything. "You know, we've got a guy at the state attorney general's office now, right? Joey Martinelli. Used to be a shop steward at Local 134. He runs their elder fraud unit. If you've got documentation, he'll listen to you." I'd been assuming that my case was too complicated, too ambiguous, too dependent on family relationships for law enforcement to take seriously. But Tommy made it sound like this was exactly the kind of thing they dealt with regularly. The meeting with Joey Martinelli happened the following Tuesday, in a sterile government office that smelled like industrial carpet and burned coffee. Joey was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of practical demeanor that came from years of dealing with people's problems rather than just talking about them. He listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking for clarification about dates or dollar amounts. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "How much of this can you prove?" he asked. I spread the documents across his desk. Bank statements, investment records, correspondence with the advisory firm, records of the house sale, mortgage information for Danny and Jessica's home purchase. Everything I'd been collecting for months, organized chronologically and cross-referenced with explanatory notes. Joey spent 20 minutes reviewing the material, and I could see his expression change as he understood the scope of the scheme. "This isn't just bad financial advice," he said finally. "This looks like systematic exploitation of a vulnerable adult, possibly with criminal intent." But then came the reality check I'd been expecting. "The problem is," he said, "you signed documents authorizing these transactions. You worked with licensed professionals. Even if we can prove that you were misled about the nature of the investments, proving criminal intent is going to be difficult. However," he continued, "there are other avenues we can explore. The investment advisor clearly violated his fiduciary duty by putting you in inappropriate high-risk investments. The failure to disclose his previous regulatory violations might constitute fraud. And if we can establish that your son was receiving kickbacks or undisclosed compensation, that opens up additional charges." Joey asked if I'd be willing to participate in what he called a controlled contact, essentially calling Danny and Jessica while law enforcement listened in, trying to get them to admit to elements of the scheme on a recorded line. The idea terrified me. Despite everything they'd done, Despite the theft and the manipulation and the threats, they were still my family. The thought of setting them up for criminal prosecution felt like a betrayal of everything Margaret had taught me about forgiveness and second chances. But Joey helped me see it differently. "This isn't about revenge," he said. "It's about justice. And it's about protecting other elderly people from becoming victims of the same scam." That last point hit home. If Danny and Jessica could do this to me, someone they supposedly loved, what would they do to strangers? How many other retirees might fall victim to their elaborate financial schemes? So I agreed to make the call. The controlled contact happened the following Friday afternoon, from a conference room at the Attorney General's office. Joey and two other investigators listened on extensions while I dialed Danny's work number, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. Danny sounded surprised but pleased to hear from me. It was the first time we'd spoken since Thanksgiving, and he seemed eager to repair the relationship. He asked about my health, mentioned that he'd been thinking about calling, suggested we get together for dinner soon. But when I brought up the investment account, his tone changed immediately. I told him I'd been reviewing the statements, that I was concerned about some of the charges, that I needed him to help me understand what had happened to my money. There was a long pause before he responded. "Dad," he said, "I know you're frustrated with the performance of the account, but these things take time. The market's been volatile, and sometimes you have to weather short-term losses to achieve long-term gains." It was the same script he'd been feeding me for months, but now I was listening with different ears. I pushed harder, asking about specific trades, about the margin loans, about the fees that seemed to correspond with his personal expenses. And that's when he made the mistake that would eventually send him to prison. "Dad," he said, his voice getting defensive, "I think you're confused about how this works. Yes, there are management fees associated with active trading strategies. Yes, some of those fees help compensate the people who are working to grow your portfolio. But that's standard practice in the industry." I asked him to be more specific about the compensation arrangements. Who was getting paid and how much and for what services? Another long pause. Then, "Dad, I can't discuss the details of business arrangements with you. There are confidentiality agreements, professional obligations. You need to trust that we're acting in your best interests." But I pressed him further, mentioning the European vacation, the country club membership, the BMW lease that seemed to correspond with charges to my account. That's when his story started to fall apart. "Look," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "Jessica and I work hard for our money. We deserve to enjoy the fruits of our success. If some of our business activities generate income that allows us to live well, that's not your concern." The investigators were taking furious notes. On a recorded line, Danny had just admitted that my investment account was generating income for him and Jessica, and that he considered this arrangement none of my business. But the most damning admission came when I asked him directly whether he thought his arrangement with the investment advisor was ethical. "Dad," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, "this is a complicated situation. Yes, we've benefited from some of the business relationships that grew out of managing your account. But we've also taken care of you, made sure you had a safe place to live, handled all the complex financial details you couldn't manage yourself." There it was. On a recorded line, witnessed by law enforcement officials, my son had admitted to profiting from my investment account, while justifying it as payment for taking care of me. The call ended awkwardly, with Danny promising to send me more detailed account statements and me promising to think about his explanations. But as soon as I hung up the phone, Joey was smiling. "That's enough for a criminal referral," he said. "We've got admission of undisclosed financial benefits, possible violation of fiduciary duty, and elder financial abuse. The district attorney's office will be very interested in this case." The first call I made was to Carol at the library. She'd become more than just a helpful librarian over the past year. She'd become a friend, and more importantly, she'd become a witness to my research. I asked her if she'd be willing to sign an affidavit detailing the documents I'd shown her, the questions I'd asked, the timeline of my discoveries. She agreed immediately. The second call was to my lawyer, the elder law specialist I'd consulted months earlier. I told him I was ready to move forward with formal action, but not the kind he might expect. I didn't want to file criminal charges or pursue civil litigation. I wanted something more targeted, more personal. I wanted to destroy their reputation the same way they'd tried to destroy my financial security. The third call was to Richard, Jessica's father. He was a successful professional, the kind of man who understood that reputation was everything in business and social circles. When I reached him at his dental practice, his voice was stiff and formal, but he agreed to meet with me. We met that Tuesday at a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, neutral territory where we could speak privately. Richard looked tired, older than he had at Thanksgiving. The revelations about his daughter had clearly shaken him. "I want to apologize for what happened on Thursday," he said before I could speak. "Jessica's behavior was inexcusable. Patricia and I are mortified." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I didn't ask you here for an apology. I want to discuss restitution." Richard's eyes narrowed. He was back in professional mode, evaluating risk and exposure. "What kind of restitution?" I pulled out a simple one-page document I'd prepared. It outlined exactly what I wanted: not money, not criminal prosecution, not public humiliation, something much more surgical. "I want Danny and Jessica to sell the house," I said. "I want them to return the $200,000 they used for their down payment, plus interest calculated at the same rate they were charging me in investment fees. And I want Jessica to publicly acknowledge what she did, in writing, to everyone who was at that dinner table." Richard read the document twice before responding. "This is quite reasonable," he said finally. "More reasonable than they deserve. But what if they refuse?" "Then I go to the State Attorney General's office with everything I have," I said. "I file complaints with the SEC about the investment advisor. I contact the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation about Danny's role in the scheme. And I make sure that every person in their professional and social circles knows exactly what they did to me." Richard nodded slowly. He understood the threat. In their world, reputation was currency, and scandal was bankruptcy. "I'll talk to them," he said. But before he could have that conversation, Jessica made a critical mistake. That Wednesday evening, she called me. Not Danny, Jessica herself, for the first time since our confrontation the year before. She was angry, defensive, and completely unaware that she was about to provide me with exactly the evidence I needed. "You can't do this to us," she said without preamble. "We have worked too hard to build our life to let a confused old man destroy everything." I let her talk. I let her rage about how ungrateful I was, how they'd only been trying to help me, how I didn't understand the complexities of modern finance. I let her threaten me again with guardianship proceedings, with commitment to a nursing home, with complete isolation from my son. And all the while I was indeed recording the conversation. This time it wasn't a bluff. The recording app on my phone captured every word, every threat, every admission, including the moment when she finally said what I'd been waiting to hear. "Fine," she said, her voice shrill with frustration. "You want to know the truth? Yes, we needed your money. Yes, we planned it from the beginning. But so what? You were just going to waste it sitting in some savings account, and we put it to good use. We gave you a better life at Sunset Manor, we took care of all the details, and this is how you repay us?" Bingo. I sent a copy of that recording to Richard the next morning, along with a revised version of my demands. The timeline had just accelerated significantly. Richard called me back within 2 hours. "They'll agree to your terms," he said, "all of them. But I need you to promise me something in return." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll give Danny a chance to make this right. He's made terrible choices, but he's still your son. Don't let Jessica's poison destroy that relationship forever." It was a fair request, and honestly, it was what I'd been hoping for all along. I didn't want to lose Danny permanently. I wanted him to understand the consequences of his actions, but I also wanted him to have a path back to redemption. The house went on the market that Friday. Jessica and Danny moved out before Christmas into a modest apartment in a less prestigious neighborhood. The sale closed in February, and I received a cashier's check for $247,000. My original down payment money plus interest calculated at the exorbitant rate their investment advisor had been charging me. But more importantly, I received a handwritten letter from Jessica. It was delivered to me personally, along with copies sent to her parents, her sister, and everyone else who'd been at that Thanksgiving dinner. In it, she acknowledged that she had deliberately misled me about the investment advisor, that she had known about his regulatory problems, and that she had benefited financially from my losses. The letter was carefully worded, probably reviewed by a lawyer. But it was public, and it was permanent. Anyone who Googled her name in the future would find references to her admission of elder financial abuse. Danny's letter was different, less formal, more personal, but also more painful to read. "Dad," he wrote, "I know I can't undo what I've done to you. I can't give you back the house where I grew up, or the sense of security I stole from you, or the trust I violated. I let Jessica convince me that we were helping you, that we were making smart financial decisions for everyone involved. But the truth is, I was greedy, and selfish, and weak. I don't know if you can ever forgive me. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that I understand now what I did wrong, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. I'm leaving the investment firm. I can't work for a company that enables the kind of predatory practices that hurt you. Jessica and I are separating. I can't be married to someone who would threaten my own father with guardianship proceedings. I know you probably don't want to see me or talk to me, but if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to try to rebuild what we had, I'll be waiting." The letter was signed, "Your son," not "Love, Danny," and something about that formality broke my heart in a way that all his previous betrayals hadn't managed to do. I didn't respond to the letter immediately. I needed time to process everything that had happened, to figure out what I wanted my future to look like. But I kept it, along with all the other documents from this entire ordeal. Evidence of how a family could fall apart, and maybe, eventually, evidence of how it could be put back together. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came some unexpected opportunities. The cashier's check from the house sale, combined with what remained of my original investment account, gave me about $390,000. Not quite what I'd started with, but enough to change my circumstances significantly. I could have stayed at Sunset Manor. It was comfortable enough, and I'd made some friends among the other residents. But something about the place felt like giving up, like accepting that my useful life was over. I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I found a small house to rent in my old neighborhood, just 6 blocks from where I'd lived with Margaret and raised Danny. It wasn't the same house, I could never go back to that, but it was familiar territory, surrounded by memories that didn't hurt anymore. The house came with a workshop in the basement, and for the first time in years I had a project that excited me. I started building furniture. Simple pieces at first, a coffee table for the living room, a bookshelf for Margaret's old books. But as my confidence returned, I began taking on more complex projects. Word got around the neighborhood about the old electrician who was making beautiful furniture in his basement workshop. People started asking if I'd take commissions, a dining table for a young family down the street, a bedroom set for newlyweds who couldn't afford store prices, custom built-ins for a couple renovating their kitchen. The first commission came from Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who ran the corner grocery store where I'd been shopping for 30 years. Her granddaughter was getting married, and she wanted something special for the new couple, a hope chest that could hold wedding linens and eventually become a toy chest for their future children. I spent weeks on that piece, selecting the wood grain carefully, hand-cutting the dovetail joints, sanding every surface to silk smoothness. Mrs. Chen had shown me old photographs of hope chests from her family in China, intricate pieces with carved panels and brass hardware. I couldn't replicate the traditional Chinese designs, but I could capture the spirit, something built to last generations, made with love and attention to detail. When I delivered the finished hope chest, Mrs. Chen started crying. She ran her weathered hands over the smooth surface, opened and closed the lid to test the hinges, inhaled the scent of fresh wood and finishing oil. "My husband would have loved this," she said. "He was a carpenter in Shanghai before we came to America. He always said you could tell everything about a craftsman from how he treated the wood." She insisted on paying me more than we'd agreed on, and when I protested, she waved away my objections. "Good work deserves good pay," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." But more than the money, it was her reaction that mattered. The way she looked at the hope chest like it was a piece of art, not just furniture. The pride in her voice when she told her customers about the craftsman down the street who'd built it. The sense that I'd created something meaningful, something that would outlast me. That feeling was addictive. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was doing work that felt important rather than just necessary. Not just keeping the lights on or fixing broken things, but creating something beautiful that would bring joy to people's lives. The commissions started coming faster than I could handle them. A bookshelf for the young teacher next door, built to fit perfectly in her tiny apartment. A kitchen table for a newly divorced woman who was starting over, designed to expand from seating for 2 to seating for 8 when her children visited. A toy chest for the couple with twins, with rounded corners and soft close hinges for safety. Each piece taught me something new about woodworking, about design, about listening to what people really needed rather than what they thought they wanted. The divorced woman didn't just need a table. She needed a symbol of independence, proof that she could create a beautiful home by herself. The young parents didn't just need storage for toys. They needed something that would grow with their children, that would still be beautiful when it eventually became a coffee table in a college dorm room. I wasn't just making furniture anymore. I was solving problems, creating solutions, building connections between people and the spaces they called home. The work also reconnected me with skills I'd forgotten I had. 40 years of electrical work had given me steady hands, an eye for precision, and the patience to work through complex problems systematically. But it had also taught me about understanding systems, about how different components work together to create something functional and reliable. Furniture making used all of those skills, plus others I'd never had the chance to develop. The artistic eye needed to select wood grain and design proportions, the mathematical precision required to cut joints that fit perfectly, the planning skills necessary to visualize a finished piece and work backward through all the steps needed to create it. Most of all, it required the kind of patience that came not from resignation, but from confidence. When you knew what you were doing, when you had the skills and experience to solve whatever problems arose, you could take the time necessary to do things right. I wasn't trying to make money, exactly. My pension and Social Security covered my basic expenses, and I had the nest egg from the house sale if I needed it. But there was something deeply satisfying about creating things with my hands again, about solving problems and delivering quality work that people appreciated. It reminded me of why I'd become an electrician in the first place, back when I was 18 and thought I knew everything. There was dignity in skilled work, in making things that lasted, in being useful to your community. By summer, I had more requests than I could handle. I was working 6 days a week, and my back was complaining about all the bending and lifting. But I felt more alive than I had since Margaret died. People knew my name again. They valued my time and my expertise. I mattered. That's when Danny came to see me. It was a Saturday afternoon in July, hot and humid, the way Chicago summers always are. I was in the workshop, sanding a jewelry box I'd made for Mrs. Patterson across the street. Her granddaughter was getting married in September. When I heard the footsteps on the basement stairs, I assumed it was another customer. But when I looked up from the workbench, my son was standing there. He looked different. Thinner, older, like he'd aged 5 years in the 8 months since Thanksgiving. His clothes were nicer than anything I'd ever owned. Even after losing the house, he was still making good money at his new job, but there was something defeated in his posture. "Hi, Dad," he said quietly. I set down the sandpaper and really looked at him. This was the first time we'd been alone together since that awful confrontation in his home office, and I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me was still angry, still hurt by the betrayal. But part of me just saw my little boy, standing in the same spot where I'd taught him to use tools and build things with his hands. "Danny," I said finally, "I wondered when you'd show up." He gestured toward the jewelry box on my workbench. "I heard you were making furniture. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store told me her daughter bought a table from you." "News travels fast in the old neighborhood," I said. "Always did." We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, two men who'd once been able to talk about anything but now couldn't find common ground. Finally, Danny spoke. "Jessica and I are getting divorced," he said. "Papers were filed last month. It should be final by Christmas." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything Jessica had done, despite the pain she'd caused, divorce was still a failure of hope, a recognition that promises made couldn't be kept. "Are you?" Danny asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. "Sorry, I mean." I thought about it for a moment. "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry it came to that. I'm sorry you couldn't find a way to work it out. I'm sorry the woman I walked down the aisle turned out to be someone who could treat family the way she treated me." Danny nodded, accepting my words without argument. "She's not a bad person," he said quietly. "She's just scared. Scared of not having enough. Scared of not being successful enough. Scared of ending up like her parents when they were struggling." "That doesn't excuse what she did," I said. "No," Danny agreed. "It doesn't. And it doesn't excuse what I did either." He was quiet for a long moment, looking around the workshop. At the tools hanging on pegboards, the lumber stacked in neat piles, the half-finished projects waiting for attention. It looked almost exactly like my old workshop in the basement of the house where he'd grown up. "I remember you teaching me to use that saw," he said, pointing to my circular saw on the workbench. "I was 12, and you made me practice cutting scraps for 2 hours before you'd let me work on anything real." "You were impatient," I said, "wanted to jump ahead to the finished product without learning the fundamentals." "Sounds familiar," Danny said with a sad smile. "I guess some things never change." "Some things do, though," I said. "You wrote me a letter. You acknowledged what you did wrong. That's more than a lot of people would do." Danny's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back what we took from you. But I need you to know how sorry I am. I could have held on to my anger. I could have made him suffer, made him beg, made him work for forgiveness the way I'd had to work to rebuild my life. But standing there in my workshop, looking at my son crying for the mistakes he'd made, I realized that revenge had already run its course. "I know you are," I said, "and I forgive you." The hug that followed was awkward at first. Two men who hadn't touched each other in over a year, both afraid of breaking something fragile and new. But gradually, we relaxed into it, and for a moment it felt like we were family again. Danny came back the next weekend, and the weekend after that. At first he just watched me work, asked questions about techniques and tools, helped with simple tasks like measuring and marking lumber. But gradually, as his hands remembered the skills I'd taught him 20 years earlier, he became more useful. It wasn't the same as it had been when he was a boy. Too much had happened for us to pretend nothing had changed. But it was something new, something built on acknowledgement of past mistakes rather than denial of them. We talked while we worked, about Margaret and how much we both still missed her, about the old neighborhood and how it was changing as young families moved in, about his new job at a smaller investment firm, one that specialized in ethical investing and had strict policies about conflicts of interest. The conversations were different from the superficial exchanges we'd had during the Jessica years. Without her managing and moderating every interaction, Danny and I were able to talk about things that mattered. He told me about the therapy he'd been attending, how he was trying to understand the choices he'd made and the person he'd become. He talked about the weight of carrying secrets, about how exhausting it had been to maintain lies that got more complicated with every conversation. I told him about the loneliness I'd felt at Sunset Manor, about how Jessica's constant undermining had made me doubt my own capabilities. I described the moment when I realized I was being systematically robbed, and how that realization had been both devastating and oddly liberating. Most importantly, we talked about Margaret. For the first time since her death, Danny was able to share memories of his mother, without Jessica redirecting the conversation or making comments about moving on. We laughed about her terrible cooking experiments, her habit of rearranging furniture when she was stressed, her uncanny ability to predict which of his girlfriends were trouble. She would have seen through Jessica immediately, Danny said one afternoon as we worked on sanding a coffee table. Mom had radar for people who weren't genuine. Why didn't I? He asked, and the pain in his voice was raw and honest. Because you wanted to be happy, I said. Because after watching your mother die, you deserved to be happy. Jessica was beautiful and smart, and she made you feel successful. There's nothing wrong with wanting that. But I should have protected you, he said, instead of letting her convince me to steal from you. We all make mistakes, I said. The question is what we do after we realize we've made them. Danny had done more than just acknowledge his mistakes. He'd left the investment firm that had enabled the scheme, taken a significant pay cut to work for a company that aligned with his values. He'd cooperated fully with the criminal investigation, providing documents and testimony that helped prosecutors build cases against the investment advisor and the shell companies that had been used to launder my money. Most importantly, he'd ended his marriage to Jessica and begun the hard work of figuring out who he wanted to be when he wasn't trying to impress someone else. The divorce proceedings were ugly, as these things often are. Jessica fought for everything: the house, the furniture, half of Danny's retirement account, alimony that would have lasted for years. She hired an expensive lawyer who tried to paint Danny as a controlling husband who had manipulated her into participating in financial crimes she didn't understand. But Danny's own lawyer had done his homework. The evidence of Jessica's central role in planning and executing the scheme was overwhelming. The recorded phone calls, the email correspondence, the timeline showing how systematically she'd manipulated me into giving up my house and my independence. The final divorce settlement gave Jessica enough money to start over somewhere else, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She moved back to Michigan within a month of the papers being signed, and as far as I knew, Danny hadn't heard from her since. He never mentioned Jessica unless I asked, and when he did talk about her, it was with sadness rather than anger. The divorce was proceeding amicably, he said. They were splitting their remaining assets equally, and she was moving back to her hometown in Michigan to start over. I hope she finds what she's looking for, I said, and I meant it. Jessica had made terrible choices, had caused tremendous pain, but she was still a human being who deserved a chance at happiness. Danny looked at me with surprise. After everything she did to you, you can say that? She's lost everything too, I said. Her marriage, her reputation, her relationship with her family. That's a heavy price to pay for anyone. One Saturday in September, Danny brought a surprise visitor to the workshop. A woman about his age, with dark hair and an easy smile, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had paint stains on the sleeves. Dad, he said, I'd like you to meet Sarah. Sarah, this is my father, Eugene. Sarah shook my hand with a firm grip and looked around the workshop with genuine interest. Danny's told me so much about this place, she said. He says you taught him everything he knows about building things. That was a long time ago, I said. He's had to relearn most of it. Sarah laughed. That's what he said. But from what I can see, you're an excellent teacher. She was an artist, it turned out. Painted murals for schools and community centers, taught art classes at a local college. She and Danny had met at a volunteer event, building playground equipment for an inner-city daycare center. They'd been dating for about 2 months. What I liked about Sarah immediately was that she didn't try too hard. She didn't gush about how wonderful it was to meet me, didn't make a big show of being interested in woodworking, didn't act like she was auditioning for the role of daughter-in-law. She just talked to me like a normal person, asked thoughtful questions about my work, and treated Danny with the kind of casual affection that suggested genuine feelings rather than performance. She also wasn't afraid to challenge him. When Danny started explaining a joint technique incorrectly, Sarah politely pointed out his mistake, and asked me to demonstrate the right way. When he got frustrated with a difficult cut, she reminded him that his father had probably made the same mistake when he was learning. By the end of the afternoon, I found myself hoping I'd see more of her. Over the following months, Sarah became a regular visitor to the workshop. Sometimes she came with Danny, sometimes she came alone, usually bringing coffee and pastries from the bakery near her apartment. She had good instincts for design and color, and she started helping me plan more complex projects. The three of us built a hope chest together for a young couple in the neighborhood. Sarah designed a pattern of flowers and vines to be carved into the lid. Danny handled the joinery and assembly, and I supervised and filled in where needed. It was the most beautiful piece I'd ever made, and watching Sarah and Danny work together on it gave me hope that this relationship might be different. Danny was different with Sarah than he'd been with Jessica. More relaxed, more himself, less concerned with impressing her or living up to some image of success. When Sarah teased him about his perfectionist tendencies, he laughed instead of getting defensive. When she suggested they spend Saturday afternoon at a street festival instead of working in the shop, he agreed without checking his phone or worrying about missed opportunities. It reminded me of how I'd been with Margaret when we were young, comfortable enough to be imperfect, secure enough to prioritize the relationship over individual ambitions. But the real test came in November, almost exactly a year after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. Danny called me on a Tuesday evening to ask if I'd like to have Thanksgiving dinner with him and Sarah at her apartment. Nothing fancy, he said. Just the three of us, maybe watch some football, keep it simple and low-key. I accepted immediately, but privately I was nervous. The last time I'd shared a Thanksgiving meal with my son, it had ended with exposed lies and broken relationships. What if this time was different, but in a bad way? What if the wounds from the previous year were still too fresh? What if I said or did something that reminded everyone of all the pain we'd been through? But when I arrived at Sarah's apartment that Thursday afternoon, carrying a bottle of wine and a small wooden box I'd made to hold her art supplies, I realized my worries had been unnecessary. Sarah's place was small but warm, filled with her paintings and plants and books. The dinner table was set simply, no fine china or crystal glasses, just everyday dishes and cloth napkins that looked like they'd been used many times before. The smells coming from the kitchen were homey and familiar: roast turkey, stuffing, green bean casserole. Danny answered the door wearing an apron that read, "Kiss the Cook," and had flour in his hair. He looked happier than I'd seen him in years, and when he hugged me, it felt natural and unforced. Sarah was in the kitchen, putting finishing touches on the meal. She accepted the wine graciously and admired the wooden box, running her fingers over the smooth finish and the carved design on the lid. "This is beautiful," she said. "You really made this?" "With some help from Danny," I said. "He did the carving work." Danny's face lit up with pride. It was a small moment, but it mattered. For the first time in years, he was proud of something we'd created together. The dinner conversation was easy and natural. Sarah told stories about her students. Danny described a challenging project at work. I shared updates about my furniture commissions. We talked about the neighborhood, about upcoming holiday plans, about a documentary Sarah had watched about traditional crafts. But the moment I remember most clearly came when Sarah asked me about Margaret. "Danny's told me wonderful things about his mother," she said. "I'm sorry I never got to meet her." "She would have liked you," I said, and I meant it. Margaret always said the measure of a person was how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them. "You do that naturally." Sarah smiled, but then her expression grew more serious. "Danny also told me about what happened last Thanksgiving," she said. "I hope you know how sorry he is about all of that." I looked at my son, who was staring at his plate with the same expression he'd worn as a child when he'd broken something valuable and was waiting to find out his punishment. "We've talked about it," I said. "Mistakes were made, lessons were learned, and we're moving forward." But Sarah wasn't done. "I need you to know something," she said. "I would never ask Danny to choose between his family and me. I think what happened before was partly because Jessica felt like she had to compete with you for Danny's loyalty. That's never going to happen with us." She looked directly at me when she said it, and I could see that she meant every word. This wasn't a performance or a manipulation, it was a promise offered freely and without conditions. "Thank you," I said. "That means more to me than you probably realize." Danny reached over and took Sarah's hand, and for a moment the three of us sat there in comfortable silence, understanding that something important had just been established. The rest of the dinner passed without incident, but as we were cleaning up, Danny pulled me aside for a private conversation. "I want to ask Sarah to marry me," he said quietly, "but I won't do it without your blessing." I looked across the kitchen at Sarah, who was washing dishes and humming something under her breath. She'd already made it clear that she considered me part of the family, that she valued my relationship with Danny, that she had no interest in the kind of toxic dynamics that had poisoned his first marriage. "Do you love her?" I asked. "More than I've ever loved anyone," Danny said. "More than I thought I was capable of loving someone." "Does she make you happy?" "Every day," he said. "Even when we disagree about things, even when we're stressed about work or money or the future, she makes me want to be better than I am." "Then you have my blessing," I said, "and my support." The proposal happened 2 weeks later, at the Christmas tree lighting in Millennium Park. Danny had asked Sarah to meet him there after her evening art class, told her he wanted to walk around the city and look at holiday decorations. When they got to the big tree, he got down on one knee in front of hundreds of strangers and asked her to be his wife. She said yes before he'd finished asking the question. I wasn't there for the proposal, but I was at the celebration dinner the next evening. Sarah kept staring at her ring, not a massive diamond like Jessica had worn, but a vintage sapphire that had belonged to Danny's grandmother, and talking about how surprised she'd been, how perfect the moment had felt. They're planning a small wedding for next summer, probably in Sarah's hometown in Wisconsin. Her parents are retired teachers, the kind of people who spend their vacations camping and their free time volunteering at animal shelters. Danny's nervous about meeting them, but I think they're going to love him. The engagement has given me something I didn't expect to have again: hope for the future. Not just my own future, but my family's future. Danny and Sarah talk about having children someday, about buying a house with a big backyard and a workshop where Grandpa Eugene can teach the next generation to use tools properly. The house hunting process has been completely different from Danny's first experience with real estate. This time, there are no schemes or shortcuts or attempts to use other people's money for down payments. Danny and Sarah have been saving diligently for 3 years, living in a modest apartment, driving used cars, building their nest egg the old-fashioned way. They've asked for my advice throughout the process, not because they need my money, but because they value my experience. I've gone with them to look at properties, helped them evaluate the condition of electrical systems and structural elements, shared what I learned from 40 years of working in other people's homes about what makes a house truly livable. The house they finally chose is a modest bungalow in a neighborhood similar to where I raised Danny, close enough to my rental that I can walk there, but far enough away that we all have our privacy. It needs work. The kitchen is from the 1970s, the bathroom fixtures are older than Danny, and there's a leak in the basement that will require some creative plumbing solutions. But it has good bones, as Margaret used to say. Solid foundation, quality construction, rooms with character and natural light. Most importantly, it has a detached garage that could easily be converted into a workshop, with enough space for both woodworking and a small electrical repair business. Danny and Sarah have asked me to help with the renovation work, not as a charity case who needs something to keep busy, but as a skilled craftsman whose expertise they genuinely need. We've spent evenings at my kitchen table, sketching floor plans and discussing project timelines, figuring out how to modernize the house while preserving its original character. Sarah wants to paint a mural on the wall of what will eventually be the nursery, something whimsical and colorful that could grow with a child from infancy to adolescence. Danny wants to restore the original hardwood floors, which are hidden under decades of carpet and linoleum. I want to update the electrical system to handle modern appliances while maintaining the house's vintage charm. It's going to be a long project, probably 2 years of weekends and evenings before everything is finished. But for the first time in years, I have something to look forward to that extends beyond my own immediate needs. It's not the future I would have imagined 2 years ago, when I was sitting alone in Sunset Manor, wondering how my life had gone so wrong. But it's a future worth looking forward to, built on honesty and forgiveness, and the kind of love that doesn't demand perfection. I still think about Jessica sometimes. Wonder how she's doing in Michigan, whether she's found work, whether she's learned anything from the disasters she created. Danny mentioned that she'd sent him a Christmas card last year, nothing elaborate, just a simple note wishing him well and hoping he was happy. I hope she is learning to be happy too. Not the desperate, acquisitive kind of happiness that drove her to steal from me, but the quieter satisfaction that comes from living honestly and treating people with respect. The truth is, Jessica taught me something valuable, even though that wasn't her intention. She showed me that I was stronger than I thought I was, more resilient than I'd given myself credit for. When she tried to convince me that I was a confused old man who couldn't take care of himself, she forced me to prove her wrong. And in the process of proving her wrong, I discovered that my useful life wasn't over, that I still had skills to offer, relationships to build, contributions to make. That being 67 didn't mean being invisible or irrelevant or ready for the scrap heap. The furniture business has grown beyond what I ever expected. I've got a waiting list of customers, and last month a local furniture store asked if I'd be interested in selling some pieces through them. I'm not ready for that kind of expansion yet, but it's nice to know the option exists. More importantly, the work has connected me with my community in ways I hadn't experienced since my union days. The young family down the street stops by regularly to show me how their children are growing, to ask advice about home repairs, to bring me cookies their daughter made in school. Mrs. Patterson introduces me to her friends as the craftsman, and several of them have commissioned pieces for their own homes. I'm not just Eugene the lonely widower anymore. I'm Eugene the woodworker, Eugene the neighbor, Eugene who can fix anything and builds beautiful things and always has time to listen to your problems. And I'm still Danny's dad. That relationship will never be the same as it was before Jessica's betrayal, but in some ways it's better now. We don't take each other for granted anymore. We don't make assumptions about loyalty or support. We've learned to appreciate what we have instead of focusing on what we lack. Last weekend, Sarah brought her parents to visit Chicago, and we all spent Saturday afternoon in the workshop. Her father, a retired history teacher named Bill, was fascinated by my collection of vintage hand tools. Her mother, Mary, admired the detailed carving on a jewelry box I was finishing. But the moment that made me happiest was watching Danny explain a complex joinery technique to Bill while Sarah and Mary discussed color schemes for a painted cabinet. 4 people from different backgrounds and generations, brought together by shared interest and mutual respect. That's what family should look like, I thought. Not the artificial harmony that Jessica had tried to create through manipulation and control, but the authentic connection that comes from accepting people as they are, while encouraging them to be their best selves. As I write this, it's been 18 months since that terrible Thanksgiving dinner that started this whole story. 18 months since Jessica whispered that I didn't belong at my own son's table. 18 months since I realized I was being robbed by the people I loved most. I could have spent those 18 months consumed by anger and bitterness. I could have let the betrayal define my future, could have withdrawn from relationships and convinced myself that trust was impossible. Instead, I chose to fight back. Not with lawsuits or criminal charges or public humiliation, but with the patient, persistent work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. My financial security, my sense of purpose, my relationship with my son, my faith in the possibility of genuine family connection. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, days when the anger threatened to consume everything else, moments when I wondered if forgiveness was just another word for giving up. But I'm glad I didn't give up. I'm glad I found the strength to fight for what mattered, to demand accountability without destroying hope, to protect myself without closing my heart to new possibilities. And now, as I prepare for another Thanksgiving, this one with Danny and Sarah and her parents, in a rented cabin in Wisconsin, I realized that my story isn't really about revenge at all. It's about resilience. It's about the difference between justice and vengeance, between protecting yourself and destroying others. Most of all, it's about understanding that being hurt doesn't mean being helpless, that being betrayed doesn't mean being broken, and that being older doesn't mean being finished. If you're listening to this story and you recognize something of your own experience, if you've been pushed aside by family members who see you as a burden rather than a blessing, if you've been manipulated by people who mistake your kindness for weakness, if you've ever felt like you don't belong in your own life, then I want you to know something important. You're stronger than you think you are. You have more options than you realize, and you deserve better than being treated like you're invisible. Don't let anyone convince you that your useful life is over. Don't let anyone make you feel like you should be grateful for scraps when you deserve a seat at the table. And don't let anyone steal your future in the name of helping you manage it. Fight back, not with cruelty or vengeance, but with the quiet, persistent strength that comes from knowing your own worth. Demand accountability, build boundaries, and never apologize for taking up space in your own life. And remember that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's proving them wrong about who you are and what you're capable of. My name is Eugene Kowalski, and I learned at age 67 that I was stronger than I knew, more valuable than I'd been told, and more deserving of love and respect than I'd been taught to believe. That lesson changed everything, and if you take nothing else from my story, I hope you take that. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you see your own situation more clearly, or gave you hope that things can change, then please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone, that we're not helpless, and that it's never too late to start over. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, you belong here too, long here.